Second half of the show live. It has been another seismic day in college football. We just have that on repeat because every couple of months, or in this case, 11 months, we've had a day quite like this. It was Oklahoma and Texas last year in late July, and today on the final day of June, it is UCLA and USC leaving the Pac-12 to go to the Big Ten. Yes, you heard that correctly. Reese Davis joining us, the host of College Game Day, and certainly someone who's been covering college football for many, many years. Reese, thanks for the time. Good afternoon. And I know we're used to being shocked in this business, but when you saw this a couple of hours ago, I'm really curious what your reaction was.
Well, the first thing I thought was so much for that alliance the other conference is going to have, right? No poaching. We're going to. We're going to work together and all that jazz. So I think the first thing, Paul, is it just became a situation where they're trying to survive and get as big a piece of the pie as they can. But I didn't see it coming. In fact, just recently we were talking with the people at ESPN when I was at the College Football Playoff Summit about the potential resurgence of the Pac-12 should Lincoln Riley be able to get it going, should Dan Lanning give some stability to Oregon, things like that, and how that could potentially be a valuable television property in the future. And then just, a week later, a little over that, the two of the kingpins are apparently gone. And, I think that's the biggest thing to me is it's obvious that they don't have a lot of confidence in the financial viability that the Pac-12 would bring relative to its schedule. At least it seems that way. They're going to go for a bigger piece of the pie. And I think we're headed toward two mega conferences at some point in the future, being the Big Ten and the SEC.
Yeah, and Reese, all we can do is react and watch and cover the events, but it's almost hard to debate which side of the country has been affected the most today, whether it's the Pac-12, obviously losing two of your most important members in your biggest name, or the ACC, which has been struggling a little bit to try to keep up, and now their options are pretty slim unless someone can do the unthinkable and talk Notre Dame into joining as a football member.
That would be the thing that would keep the ACC viable. And I think, there are a couple of questions, Paul. The very next immediate question, I think, is what happens with Oregon and Washington. And, I guess John Wilner, who wrote this story, tweeted that the Big Ten's not finished. That would seem to indicate, obviously, Notre Dame is the big one out there, but it would seem to indicate that maybe Oregon and Washington, that would be the two most likely suspects of who you'd be going after. Beyond that, the schools in the ACC, and how would they, if it's even possible, get out from under the grant of rights, which has all of their media rights going to the ACC through 2036? And would any of them be willing to go through challenging that in court? Would they find it financially viable? Are the grant of rights enforceable? And from there, I think you're probably seeing some consternation at places like Clemson, maybe even at North Carolina, Miami, right off the top of my head. So I think the ACC is in a vulnerable position. Certainly, if they could add that Notre Dame football piece permanently and on a full-time basis, then that obviously changes the calculus on it.
Reese, I want to ask you about something you just said, because Pete Thamel was here earlier, and you've been, you probably lost track of the hundreds of, maybe bordering on thousands of games you've either done or hosted game day or whatever from a basketball standpoint on Tobacco Road, but Pete said that he felt North Carolina might be one of the most valuable brands that we aren't really paying much attention to. Just some of your experiences being around that program, I'm curious what you think about what he said, and because they're really, they could go anywhere. They could go up or down, really, depending on what the powers that be there decide.
I agree with Pete, actually. I would still say, probably because of the football empire that Clemson has built, I would lean slightly to Clemson. But from a long-term, probably a breadth of reach in terms of support and across the board, North Carolina probably is as valuable as anyone. Paul, you You probably remember when the SEC at one of the earlier expansions, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the A&M Missouri expansion. Right. There was talk of North Carolina and Virginia at that time. I don't know that it got very far because at that time, I'm not sure North Carolina was willing to separate from Duke, and I'm sure that's something that they would not be thrilled about now. But even as valuable a property as Duke basketball is, North Carolina is the nationwide property that to me would be more valuable and would certainly be something that would that either conference, the Big Ten or the SEC, would welcome with open arms. But again, it kind of goes back to that the contract with the grant of rights and is it financially feasible or even doable for someone to leave the ACC in the current situation.
Talking to Reese Davis I'm kind of out of hyperbole here, Reese, but it's almost because we are getting used to it. But I'm curious beyond the headlines today, having spent a lot of time in that league out there covering games and hosting game day, just the idea. It's one, Texas and Oklahoma leaving, that was understandable, but it's still hard to wrap your arms around the idea that Southern Cal is leaving that league. UCLA too, to a lesser degree, maybe more in basketball than football, but they are residents of the Rose Bowl, though. I mean, it's just that's hard to swallow in one go.
You're right. It's understandable from a business standpoint, and if you take a pragmatic view of the way the enterprise is evolving, from a standpoint of nostalgia and some of the intricacies that make college football unique, it's sad because there was always this regional pride. It was manifested on New Year's Day in the Rose Bowl with the Pac-8, Pac-10, Pac-12, and the Big Ten. The SEC had it as well, and you were able to do all of these back and forth bragging rights. And there was always a debate about which conference is better. But now we're looking toward the inevitability at some point of a vastly expanded playoff. One would imagine the homogenization of all of the leagues, which is going to change the fact of whether West Coast football is up to snuff. It doesn't matter that the West Coast powerhouse team is playing a road conference game in Minnesota next week. So a lot of that has really, I think, taken away some of the qualities. Maybe it's an inevitable thing that it has to be this way in order to sustain and to maximize itself financially. But there's something lost. Anytime you make a change like this, you lose something, and I think that we are losing something in terms of tradition, history, and those things might not write checks to pay for new coaches and all of that sort of thing, but it does have value. And it's part of the thing that makes it popular among fans, and it'll take some getting used to that instead of going to Corvallis to play, SC is going to be going to Evanston. That'll be a different thing for them.
Probably be easier to get to, though.
That's true. Yeah, at least a direct flight. Yeah, that's true.
Finally, and we don't know the answers to this, but it is ironic to think about all of the comments we heard a year ago as the CFP was unwinding because of the SEC move with Oklahoma and Texas. But knowing all these people, being at the centerpiece of the coverage for that for so long, what do you think is going to happen next with the expansion of the CFP?
They've insisted it won't happen now because of the changes prior to the elimination of, or the, once the contract runs out. I can see it maybe happening a year early. It's going to expand, Paul. I was not against the two-team BCS. I think the BCS probably got more grief than it deserved. Certainly wasn't perfect, got grief. But people got their fill of it. They wanted more. They said it wasn't fair. It lost some credibility in the side of the fans. So they went to 4. And we're approaching that stage with some of the fans. Whether it's the fatigue of the perception that the same teams are in it every year, but 5, 6, 8, 10 years from now, that may be a different group of teams. But it's going to expand. It's probably going to expand to 12. And one of the things that we're going to lose in that is the feeling of an elimination game on a Saturday at Bryant-Denny Stadium between undefeated Alabama and undefeated LSU. As great as that LSU team was, had they lost that game, they weren't going to the playoff in all likelihood. Same with, Alabama did lose, lost another one, they didn't go. You're not going to have that. When you expand it to 12, you're going to give that up. It doesn't mean the game won't be fun. It doesn't mean it won't be great. But you're going to give up that winner-take-all stakes that you have smattered throughout the season that you don't get in any other sport. Maybe it's time to pay that price, but it is a price that will affect people and be costly in many respects.
Reese Davis joining us on the events of today. Reese, many thanks. We appreciate your time as always. Hope to see you soon.